The morning sun filtered through the grimy windows of my small electronics repair shop in downtown Phoenix, casting long shadows across the cluttered workbench where I'd spent countless hours building my dream. The familiar hum of diagnostic equipment and the scent of soldering flux had become as comforting as a mother's embrace over the past 3 years. Circuit boards in various stages of repair lay scattered across my workspace like electronic puzzle pieces waiting to be solved. The walls were lined with shelves containing organized bins of resistors, capacitors, and microchips, the building blocks of the digital world that had fascinated me since childhood. But that Tuesday in March, everything felt different. The air conditioning unit wheezed against the Arizona heat that was already climbing toward 90 degrees despite the early hour, and my hands trembled slightly as I stared at the email that would change everything. The coffee I'd made an hour earlier sat cold and forgotten beside my keyboard, steam no longer rising from the ceramic mug emblazoned with the shop's logo that I'd designed myself during those optimistic early days. Partnership termination notice glowed mockingly from my laptop screen, the harsh blue light reflecting off my reading glasses and casting an electronic pallor across my face. My cousin Derek's business logo sat at the top of the message like a grinning skull, a stylized mountain peak with Morrison IT Solutions emblazoned beneath it in the same confident font he'd used for all our joint marketing materials. 3 years of partnership, 3 years of shared dreams and late-night planning sessions, reduced to cold legal jargon and corporate speak that could have been written by any soulless attorney in any glass tower downtown. The irony wasn't lost on me that Derek was terminating our partnership through email rather than a phone call or face-to-face conversation. For someone who'd built his reputation on personal relationships and family connections, he'd chosen the most impersonal method possible to destroy what I'd thought was both a business arrangement and a renewed family bond. I'd met Derek at our grandmother's funeral 5 years earlier, a gray October day in Sacramento where the extended family had gathered to say goodbye to the woman who'd been the unofficial matriarch of our sprawling clan. The funeral home had that distinctive smell of lilies and industrial carpet cleaner that seems universal to such places, and the soft murmur of grief-stricken relatives created a constant background hum of sorrow and memory. We'd always been distant, cousins, separated by geography and the complex family dynamics that develop over generations of marriages, divorces, and relocations. Derek was the successful son of my Uncle Robert, while I was the struggling nephew still finding his place in the world. Our families had exchanged Christmas cards and birthday acknowledgments, but we'd never really known each other beyond the superficial pleasantries that pass for family relationships in modern America. But grief has a way of breaking down barriers and bringing people together in unexpected ways. After the service, during the reception where elderly relatives shared stories and the younger generation stood around feeling awkward in our funeral clothes, Derek and I found ourselves sitting at the same small table with paper cups of coffee and slices of store-bought cake that the funeral home provided. What began as polite conversation about our grandmother's life evolved into something deeper as we discovered shared interests and complementary professional skills. Derek, then 31 to my 23, had an established IT consulting firm in Sacramento that specialized in helping small to medium-sized businesses modernize their technology infrastructure. I was just beginning my electronics repair business in Phoenix, armed with a degree in electrical engineering and dreams that far exceeded my bank account. "You know, Marcus," Derek had said that day, stirring sugar into his coffee with mechanical precision, "we could really help each other out. I've got clients who need hardware repair services and you've got the skills. I could send business your way, take a small finder's fee, and we both win." It had seemed perfect. Derek's established client base would provide the steady income stream I desperately needed, while I could offer his customers specialized services he couldn't provide. We'd shaken hands in that sterile funeral home reception area, and I'd felt like I was finally gaining a foothold in the business world. The partnership had started small. Derek would refer customers to me for laptop repairs, phone screen replacements, and data recovery services. In return, I'd pay him 20% of each job's revenue. It wasn't unusual in the industry, and Derek's clients were reliable, well-paying customers who appreciated quality work. Within 6 months, Derek's referrals made up nearly 60% of my business. But success bred ambition, and Derek had bigger plans. We should formalize this arrangement, he'd suggested during one of our monthly video calls. Create a proper partnership agreement, maybe even merge our operations. Think about it. You handle the hardware side, I handle the software and consulting, and we both get rich. I should have been more careful. I should have had a lawyer review the partnership agreement Derek drafted, but I was 26 years old, drowning in student loans and desperate to believe that family meant something. The document looked professional, filled with impressive legal terminology and official-sounding clauses. Derek assured me it was standard boilerplate language, nothing to worry about. "Trust me, cousin," he'd said with that easy California smile that I'd grown to associate with success. "We're family. I've got your back." The partnership had indeed grown beyond our initial modest expectations. Within the first year, we'd expanded my services to include on-site corporate repairs and small business IT support that complemented Derek's higher-level consulting work. Derek's client list seemed endless and continuously growing, and the money flowed in steadily enough that I'd been able to hire 2 part-time employees. Maria, a recent community college graduate with excellent customer service skills, and James, a semi-retired technician who brought decades of practical experience to complex repair challenges. I'd also upgraded my equipment significantly, investing in professional-grade diagnostic tools, a clean room for sensitive component work, and a customer-facing area that actually looked like a legitimate business rather than a teenager's garage workshop. For the first time in my adult life, I'd felt genuinely financially secure and optimistic about the future. The constant stress of wondering whether I'd make rent each month had been replaced by the luxury of planning ahead, saving money, and even considering larger ambitions like expanding to a second location. But somewhere along the way, the dynamics of our partnership had begun to shift in ways that I'd initially attributed to natural business growth, but now recognized as warning signs of something more troubling. Derek's communications had become more formal and demanding, shifting from the casual familiarity of family members working together to the hierarchical tone of a boss managing a subordinate. He'd begun requiring detailed reports of all work performed for shared clients, complete with time logs, parts inventories, and customer interaction summaries that took hours to compile each week. He'd demanded copies of all invoices and receipts, ostensibly for tax purposes, but with a level of scrutiny that felt more like surveillance than partnership oversight. Most invasively, he'd requested access to my business banking records and insisted on monthly financial statements that revealed far more about my personal and business finances than any legitimate partnership would require. "Just keeping everything transparent," he'd explained when I'd questioned the new requirements during one of our increasingly formal monthly video conferences. Good business practice ensures we're both protected and informed about our mutual interests. The phrase mutual interests had started appearing frequently in Derek's vocabulary, usually preceding requests that seemed to benefit his business more than our partnership. When I'd pushed back on some of the more intrusive reporting requirements, Derek had reminded me that transparency builds trust, and suggested that my reluctance to share information might indicate that I wasn't fully committed to our partnership's success. The clients had started changing too, in ways that I'd initially attributed to natural business evolution, but now recognized as systematic manipulation. What had once been straightforward repair jobs, replacing cracked screens, upgrading memory, recovering data from damaged drives, had gradually morphed into complex projects with unusual specifications that seemed to stretch far beyond legitimate IT support needs. Customers would arrive at my shop with very specific requests that often seemed to benefit Derek's consulting business more than they addressed actual hardware problems. I'd find myself installing specialized software packages that I didn't recognize, configuring network settings that seemed unnecessarily complex for small business environments, and providing services that stretched far beyond my expertise, business license, or insurance coverage. When I'd asked Derek about some of these unusual requests, he'd dismissed my concerns with explanations about integrated service delivery and holistic IT solutions that sounded impressive but didn't really address my specific questions about why a small accounting firm needed industrial-grade surveillance software, or why a local restaurant required network monitoring tools typically used by large corporations. "You're being paranoid, Marcus." Derek had laughed during our last productive video call 3 weeks before the termination email. "This is how partnerships work in the modern business environment. We're expanding our service offerings, growing together, creating comprehensive solutions for our clients. Don't you want to be successful? Don't you want to be part of something bigger than just fixing broken phones?" Now, staring at the termination notice, I realized how naive I'd been. The email was brief and brutal. "Dear Marcus, effective immediately, I am terminating our partnership agreement as outlined in Section 12.3 of our contract. As per the terms you agreed to, all client relationships and ongoing projects will transfer to my direct management. You will have 30 days to complete any work in progress and transfer all client files and contact information. Thank you for your contributions to our mutual success. Best regards, Derek Morrison, Morrison IT Solutions, Section 12.3. I scrambled through my desk drawers, searching for my copy of the partnership agreement. The pages were dog-eared now, marked with coffee stains and years of handling. I found the section and read it with growing horror. Buried in dense legal language was a clause that essentially gave Derek the right to terminate our partnership at any time and claim ownership of all client relationships established during our partnership. But that wasn't the worst part. As I read further, I discovered clauses I didn't remember agreeing to. Terms that gave Derek access to my business methods, client lists, and even my proprietary repair techniques. Language that suggested I was essentially an employee rather than a partner, despite contributing equally to our success. My phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Check your email. Time to part ways. Nothing personal, just business. Thanks for the good run." The casual tone made my stomach churn. 3 years of my life. 3 years of building something I thought we both valued, dismissed with the emotional weight of a grocery list. I spent the rest of the morning calling clients, trying to understand what was happening. The conversations were awkward and confusing. Mrs. Patterson, whose small accounting firm had been one of my most reliable customers, seemed genuinely surprised to hear from me. "Oh, Marcus, I thought you knew," she said, her voice filled with awkward sympathy. "Derek called yesterday and explained that you were leaving the business. He said he'd be handling all our IT needs directly from now on. I'm sorry to see you go. You always did such good work." Client after client told similar stories. Derek had contacted them all, spinning a narrative about my departure that made it sound voluntary, even inevitable. Some expressed regret, others seemed indifferent, but the message was clear. Derek had systematically removed me from relationships I'd spent years building. By afternoon, the full scope of Derek's carefully orchestrated plan had become devastatingly apparent. He hadn't just terminated our partnership through legal maneuvering. He'd executed a complete takeover of my business relationships that had been months, possibly years, in the making. The clients I'd nurtured through countless hours of patient service, the reputation I'd built through attention to detail and honest dealing, the trust I'd earned by consistently delivering quality work on time and within budget, all of it was being systematically transferred to Derek with surgical precision. The most professionally painful aspect of Derek's betrayal was realizing how thoroughly he'd prepared for this moment. Every new reporting requirement, every expansion of services, every modification to our working arrangements had been building toward this systematic appropriation of my business relationships. He'd used our partnership not just to access my clients, but to study my business methods, understand my competitive advantages, and position himself to replace me entirely. What made the betrayal even more devastating was the recognition that Derek had leveraged our family connection not just to establish trust, but to prevent me from taking the normal precautions that any reasonable business owner would employ when entering a partnership with a stranger. The casual family setting where we'd first discussed working together, the assumptions of shared values and mutual loyalty, the implicit understanding that family members would treat each other fairly, all of it had been weaponized against me by someone who understood exactly how to exploit those emotional vulnerabilities. The worst part was how smoothly it had all gone. Derek had planned this for months, maybe years. Every new reporting requirement, every expansion of services, every modification to our arrangements had been building toward this moment. He'd used our partnership to learn my business inside and out, then used that knowledge to replace me entirely. That evening, I sat in my empty shop as the desert sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. The familiar sounds of traffic on Central Avenue felt distant and muffled. My employees had gone home, unaware that their jobs might disappear along with the clients. The equipment I'd purchased, the lease I'd signed, the dreams I'd built, all of it suddenly felt hollow and uncertain. I thought about calling Derek, demanding an explanation, begging him to reconsider. But the termination email had been clear enough. This wasn't a misunderstanding or a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated business decision, executed with the precision of someone who'd been planning it for a long time. The partnership agreement sat on my desk, its pages now seeming to mock my younger self's optimism. I'd signed away 3 years of my life to someone I'd trusted because we shared blood and a grandmother's funeral. Family was supposed to mean something. Trust was supposed to matter. But as I locked up the shop that night, walking past the sign that still bore both our names, I realized that Derek had taught me a valuable lesson about the intersection of family and business. Some people saw relationships as opportunities to be exploited, not bonds to be honored. The question now was what I planned to do about it. The Marriott Hotel conference room buzzed with the familiar chaos of our extended family's annual reunion, a tradition that had somehow survived 3 decades of marriages, divorces, relocations, and the general entropy that affects most family gatherings over time. Folding tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes that represented a survey of American regional cuisine. My aunt's famous 3-bean casserole from her Minnesota years, my cousin's Texas-style barbecue sauce that he'd driven 8 hours to share, and my grandmother's recipe for apple pie that had been passed down through 4 generations and was now prepared by various family members with varying degrees of success. Children of various ages ran between clusters of adults, catching up on a year's worth of accumulated news, their shrieks of laughter and playground disputes adding a chaotic energy to the proceedings. The hotel's air conditioning system battled valiantly against the combined heat of 60-plus relatives gathered in Phoenix's brutal August weather, when the outside temperature was already approaching 110 degrees despite the late afternoon hour. The conference room itself was typical hotel banquet space, beige carpet, neutral wallpaper, and fluorescent lighting that managed to be both harsh and insufficient. Round tables covered with white linens had been arranged to encourage mingling, while a serving table along one wall displayed the accumulated culinary contributions of family members who'd traveled from across the Southwest for this annual gathering. Hadn't wanted to come, and every minute in the room reinforced my original instinct to stay home. 3 weeks had passed since Derek's partnership termination bombshell, and I was still reeling from the financial and emotional fallout that seemed to compound daily. My business was hemorrhaging money without Derek's client referrals. My employees were asking increasingly uncomfortable questions about job security and the future of their positions. And my landlord had started making pointed comments about next month's rent payment and the stability of my business model. The last thing I needed was to face extended family members who would inevitably ask about my successful business partnership with Derek. But my mother had insisted with the particular brand of guilt that only mothers can wield. "Marcus, honey, you can't hide from family forever. Besides, Derek will be there, and maybe you two can work things out. These business disagreements don't have to ruin family relationships." Derek had arrived fashionably late, of course, making his entrance, like a conquering hero returning from successful campaigns. He wore an expensive navy suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent, and his California tan seemed to glow under the hotel's fluorescent lighting. A small crowd had gathered around him as he regaled them with stories of his expanding business empire. "The Sacramento market has been incredible," he was saying to Uncle Robert and Aunt Linda, gesturing expansively with a crystal tumbler of what looked like top-shelf whiskey. "We just landed a contract with the state government, multi-million-dollar deal. Sometimes you have to know when to cut dead weight and focus on what really matters." His eyes found mine across the room as he said it, and his smile widened slightly. The bastard was enjoying this. I'd tried to avoid him for the first hour, sticking to conversations with cousins I rarely saw and elderly relatives who asked safe questions about my health and love life. But family reunions have a way of forcing confrontations, and eventually, the inevitable happened. I was standing near the dessert table, mechanically eating a piece of my aunt's famous apple pie, while listening to my cousin Sarah complain about her teenager's driving habits, when Derek appeared at my elbow like a bad smell. "Marcus," he said loudly enough that several nearby conversations paused. "There's my favorite business partner. How's the electronics repair game treating you these days?" His tone was jovial, friendly even, but there was something predatory in his smile. Other family members began drifting over, drawn by the prospect of drama or simply curious about the cousins they'd heard were working together. "It's going fine," I said carefully, not trusting myself to say more. The pie suddenly tasted like cardboard in my mouth. "Really? That's great to hear. I was worried when we had to part ways professionally. You know how it is. Sometimes business, relationships just run their course." Derek's voice carried the perfect note of regretful understanding, as if our partnership had ended by mutual agreement, rather than his calculated betrayal. Uncle Robert, Derek's father, and a man who'd never worked anywhere but the family construction business, nodded sagely. "That's the smart way to handle it. Keep business and family separate." Marcus probably learned a lot from working with Derek. The implication stung, that I'd been the junior partner, the apprentice learning from the master. Several other relatives murmured agreement, and I felt my face flush with embarrassment and anger. "Actually," I said, my voice tighter than I intended, "I'm considering legal action over how the partnership was terminated." The effect was immediate and devastating. Derek's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise, and several relatives actually took a step back as if I'd announced I had a contagious disease. "Legal action?" Derek repeated, his voice carrying just the right note of hurt confusion. "Marcus, what are you talking about? We ended things professionally by the book. I sent you all the proper documentation. Documentation that gave you the right to steal my clients and my business relationships," I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Documentation I never properly understood when I signed it. The room had grown quiet now, the kind of uncomfortable silence that falls over family gatherings when someone crosses an invisible line. I could feel dozens of eyes on me, could sense the shift in atmosphere from casual reunion chatter to something more serious and awkward. Derek shook his head slowly, like a disappointed parent dealing with a difficult child. "Marcus, I think you're misunderstanding how business partnerships work. I brought the clients to our arrangement. When the partnership ended, they naturally wanted to continue working with the person they had the established relationship with. That's just how these things go." "Bullshit," I said, and immediately regretted the profanity in front of my grandmother and several young cousins. "You systematically took over relationships I'd built, work I'd done, trust I'd earned. You planned this from the beginning." Derek's expression shifted to something that looked almost like pity. "Marcus, I understand you're upset. Losing clients is hard and starting over is scary. But accusations and legal threats aren't going to help your business. Maybe it's time to focus on moving forward instead of looking backward." The condescension in his voice was like gasoline on a fire. I felt 3 weeks of frustration, humiliation, and financial stress boiling over into pure rage. "I'm not making threats," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "I'm telling you that I've documented everything. Every email, every phone call, every shady modification you made to our arrangement. I'm going to sue you for breach of contract, theft of business relationships, and fraud." For just a moment, Derek's mask slipped. I saw something cold and calculating in his eyes, a glimpse of the predator beneath the family man facade. But then he threw back his head and laughed, a rich, genuine sound that carried across the suddenly silent room. "Sue me?" he said, still chuckling. "Marcus, do you have any idea what a lawsuit costs? Do you have any idea what kind of lawyers I can afford versus what you can afford? You're talking about taking on someone with resources, connections, and actual legal documentation supporting every decision I made." Other family members began to laugh too, uncomfortable chuckles at first, then more genuine amusement as Derek's confidence seemed to validate their instincts about the situation. "I mean, good luck with that," Derek continued, wiping his eyes dramatically. "But maybe you should focus on keeping your little repair shop afloat instead of playing lawyer. Some of us have real businesses to run." The laughter spread through the room like a contagion. Uncle Robert was shaking his head with paternal disappointment. Aunt Linda was whispering something to my mother that made her face crumple with embarrassment. Even some of the younger cousins were smirking, treating the whole confrontation like dinner theater. "You think this is funny?" I asked, my voice cracking slightly. "You think destroying someone's business is a joke?" "I think making wild accusations at a family reunion is funny," Derek replied smoothly. "I think threatening legal action you can't afford is funny. I think the idea of little Marcus taking on the big bad business world is honestly hilarious." The humiliation was complete and devastating. I stood in the middle of my extended family, shaking with rage and embarrassment, while they laughed at my pain and Derek's cruelty. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, reduced to a punchline at a family gathering. My mother appeared at my side, her face flushed with social embarrassment. "Marcus, honey, maybe we should go. You're obviously upset, and this isn't the place for business discussions." "Yes," Derek agreed with mock sympathy. "Family reunions are for celebrating, not for airing grievances. Marcus, I hope you can find a way to move past this. I really do wish you the best." The false kindness in his voice was the final straw. I wanted to hit him, wanted to scream, wanted to do something that would wipe that smug expression off his face and show everyone what kind of person he really was. But I was surrounded by family, outnumbered and outmaneuvered by someone who'd had weeks to prepare for this moment. Instead, I turned and walked out of the conference room with as much dignity as I could muster. Behind me, I could hear the conversations resuming. Could imagine the whispered discussions about poor Marcus and his unrealistic expectations and his embarrassing outburst. In the hotel parking lot, the August heat hit me like a physical blow. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, air conditioning running at full blast, trying to process what had just happened. Derek had humiliated me in front of my entire extended family, turned my legitimate grievances into a source of entertainment, and made me look like a delusional failure grasping at straws. But as I drove home through Phoenix's sprawling suburbs, past strip malls and housing developments that stretched toward the mountains, I realized something important. Derek's performance had been too polished, too prepared. He'd known exactly what to say, exactly how to play the room, exactly how to make me look foolish. Which meant he was worried, really worried. People don't prepare elaborate defense strategies for threats they consider genuinely laughable. Derek had spent time thinking about how to handle my accusations, had crafted responses designed to discredit me before I could make my case. He'd turned a family reunion into a preemptive strike against potential legal action. The question was, what was he so afraid I might discover? The law office of Patricia Hernandez was nothing like the gleaming corporate towers I'd imagined when I thought about lawyers. Tucked between a pawn shop and a tax preparation service in a faded strip mall on the west side of Phoenix, it felt more like a neighborhood clinic than a legal practice. The waiting area had mismatched chairs, outdated magazines, and a coffee machine that looked older than I was. But Patricia was a woman in her early 50s with steel gray hair pulled back in a practical bun that suggested someone who had neither time nor patience for elaborate personal grooming routines. She radiated the kind of competent authority that made you believe she could dissect a corporate merger agreement or negotiate a hostage situation with equal skill and composure. Her handshake was firm without being aggressive. Her eye contact was direct without being intimidating. And her general demeanor suggested someone who'd spent decades dealing with people in crisis and had developed both the empathy to understand their problems and the professional detachment necessary to solve them effectively. "Mr. Chen," she said, gesturing for me to take a seat across from her cluttered desk, which was covered with legal briefs, case files, and what appeared to be the remnants of a working lunch eaten between client meetings. "I'll be honest with you from the beginning. Most partnership disputes aren't worth pursuing from a financial perspective. They're expensive, time-consuming, and usually result in everyone losing substantial money to attorneys while the real underlying issues never get properly resolved. The legal system isn't particularly well designed for resolving business relationship problems that are fundamentally about trust and communication. Her directness was both refreshing and intimidating. Most of the other attorneys I'd spoken with had been more diplomatic in their discouragement, using language like challenging and complex to describe what Patricia was characterizing as potentially futile. But there was something about her straightforward approach that made me trust her assessment more than the polite evasions I'd received elsewhere. However, she continued, settling back in her chair and fixing me with an appraising look, that doesn't mean all partnership disputes are hopeless. If you can demonstrate systematic fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, or criminal activity, then we're talking about something entirely different from a simple business disagreement. The question is whether your situation involves legitimate legal violations or just unethical behavior that happens to be perfectly legal. It had taken me 3 weeks of exhaustive research to find Patricia, 3 weeks of making phone calls to law offices, reading online reviews, and trying to understand the complex legal landscape I was about to enter, with limited financial resources and no previous experience with civil litigation. Most of the attorneys I'd contacted initially had quoted retainer fees that exceeded my monthly income, or had politely declined to take on what they characterized as a small-time business dispute that wouldn't generate sufficient billable hours to justify their attention. The few lawyers who'd been willing to discuss my case during brief initial consultations had been discouraging about my prospects for success. Partnership disputes are notoriously difficult to prove. One downtown attorney had explained during a 15-minute phone conversation that cost me $50. Most judges see these cases as he said, she said situations where both parties share responsibility for the failed relationship. Unless you have smoking gun evidence of outright fraud, you're probably better off cutting your losses and moving on. Patricia Hernandez was different from the beginning, and not just because her fee structure was more reasonable than the corporate law firms downtown. When I'd first called her office and explained the basic outline of my situation, she'd listened, without interrupting, and asked specific questions that suggested she understood both the legal and practical dimensions of my predicament. "Mr. Chen," she'd said during that initial phone conversation, "partnership fraud cases are challenging, but they're not impossible if you've documented everything properly. The key is usually in the details, the communications, the financial records, the pattern of behavior over time. Why don't you come in next week and bring everything you have? We'll review the materials together and determine whether you have grounds for legal action." Her office, when I'd finally visited it, had reinforced my initial impression that Patricia was more interested in practical results than impressive appearances. The waiting area had mismatched furniture that looked like it had been accumulated over years, rather than purchased as a coordinated set, magazines that were several months out of date, and a coffee machine that appeared to be older than I was, but still produced remarkably good coffee. But Patricia's office itself, behind the modest waiting area, revealed someone who took her legal practice seriously, even if she didn't waste money on expensive furnishings. Law books lined every available wall space. Legal documents were organized in clearly labeled filing systems, and her desk displayed the kind of organized chaos that suggests someone who manages multiple complex cases simultaneously without losing track of important details. "I understand the challenges," I said, spreading the documents I'd brought across her desk. "But I think this might be different from typical partnership disputes." Patricia's expression remained skeptical as she began reviewing the materials I'd assembled. 3 weeks of obsessive investigation had produced a thick folder of emails, contract documents, client communications, and financial records. I'd approached the research like the electronics repair work that was my specialty, methodically, systematically, following every connection until I understood how all the pieces fit together. "Walk me through your main allegations," Patricia said, pulling on reading glasses and settling back in her chair. "Derek Morrison terminated our partnership using clauses in our agreement that I believe were fraudulently concealed," I began. "But that's just the beginning. I think he's been systematically defrauding clients and using our partnership to legitimize illegal activities." Patricia's eyebrows rose slightly. "Those are serious accusations. What evidence do you have?" I'd organized my documentation into several carefully labeled categories, and I walked Patricia through each section methodically, like a technician, explaining a complex repair procedure to a customer who needed to understand both the problem and the solution. First, the partnership agreement itself, which I'd finally had another attorney review after Derek's termination email, had forced me to confront my own negligence in signing it without proper legal counsel. The document was a masterpiece of deceptive, legal language, filled with clauses that appeared standard and reasonable on first reading, but actually gave Derek unprecedented control over business operations and client relationships. It was the kind of contract that would pass casual inspection from someone who wasn't familiar with partnership law, but would immediately raise red flags for anyone who understood the legal implications of the language being used. "Look at Section 7.2, I said, pointing to a dense paragraph buried in the middle of the contract's boilerplate language. It says that all business development activities become shared partnership assets, subject to mutual management decisions. That sounds reasonable and fair until you realize it means any client I recruited independently, any business relationship I developed through my own efforts, automatically became subject to Derek's control under the partnership agreement." Patricia nodded approvingly as she read through the section, making notes in the margins with a red pen that she wielded like a surgeon's scalpel. "This language is unusually one-sided for a legitimate partnership agreement. Most partnership contracts include reciprocal obligations and mutual protections. This reads more like an employment contract disguised as a partnership agreement. Did you have any legal representation when you signed this document?" The question made me flush with embarrassment, even though I'd expected it. Derek told me it was standard boilerplate language that he'd used for other partnerships. He said having lawyers review it would just slow down the process and cost money we didn't need to spend since we were family and trusted each other completely. "Classic manipulation technique," Patricia observed, making another note in her file. "Fraudulent. Actors often use time pressure and personal relationships to prevent victims from seeking independent legal advice. The phrase 'we're family' is particularly effective because it appeals to emotional loyalty, while discouraging practical caution. But the partnership agreement was only the foundation of what I'd discovered during my weeks of obsessive investigation. The real revelation had come when I started investigating Derek's broader business practices, using the same systematic approach I applied to diagnosing complex electronics problems, following every connection, testing every component, and refusing to accept surface explanations when the underlying evidence suggested deeper problems. Using public records databases, business registration information, Better Business Bureau complaints, and details that clients had shared during our working relationship, I'd begun to piece together a pattern of questionable activities that stretched far beyond my own situation. What had initially appeared to be a simple partnership dispute was actually part of a much larger and more sophisticated fraud scheme. "Derek's been operating what I believe is essentially a systematic shell game," I explained to Patricia, spreading out a hand-drawn organizational chart that showed the connections I'd mapped between various business entities, partnerships, and financial relationships. "He creates partnerships with small businesses like mine, uses those partnerships to gain access to clients and proprietary business methods, then terminates the partnerships and absorbs the resources into his own operations." Patricia studied my chart with growing interest. The document looked like something from a detective movie, photographs connected with colored string, business documents marked with different colored pens, timelines showing overlapping business relationships, and financial records that revealed patterns of money movement that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify business activities. "You've been remarkably thorough," she said, and I could hear genuine admiration in her voice. "Most clients come to me with complaints and emotional grievances, but very little documentation to support their allegations. This level of investigative work is usually done by professional forensic accountants, not electronics repair technicians. Tell me about these other partnerships you've identified." Through internet research, public record searches, and some creative detective work that had consumed most of my free time for 3 weeks, I'd identified at least 4 other small business owners who'd had partnership arrangements with Derek over the past 5 years. Their stories, when I'd managed to contact them, were remarkably similar to my own experience, but with variations that suggested Derek had refined his approach over time. a web designer in Portland, a small accounting firm in Denver, a graphic design studio in Las Vegas, and a computer networking specialist in Tucson. I reached out to all of them, I said. 3 were willing to talk, and their stories are remarkably similar to mine. Derek approaches them with promises of client referrals, establishes partnership agreements that give him increasing control over operations, then terminates the partnerships and takes over the client relationships. The most disturbing conversation had been with Jennifer Walsh, the graphic designer in Las Vegas. Her partnership with Derek had ended 2 years earlier, and she'd subsequently lost her business entirely. He destroyed me, she'd told me during a tearful phone conversation. I was naive and trusting, just like you. By the time I realized what was happening, he'd taken everything. My clients, my reputation, even some of my creative work that he claimed belonged to the partnership. Jennifer had wanted to pursue legal action, but couldn't afford the upfront costs. She'd eventually moved back in with her parents and taken a job at a corporate marketing firm, her entrepreneurial dreams shattered by Derek's systematic exploitation. This pattern suggests something beyond simple partnership disputes, Patricia said, reviewing my documentation with increasing interest. If you can prove systematic fraud, that changes the legal landscape significantly. But the most damaging evidence I'd discovered related to Derek's treatment of the clients themselves. During my partnership with Derek, I'd noticed increasing requests for services that seemed to stretch beyond legitimate IT support. Clients would ask me to install software that seemed designed for surveillance rather than productivity, or to configure networks in ways that appeared to violate their own company policies. At the time, I'd assumed these requests came from the clients themselves. But after the partnership termination, when I started investigating more carefully, I realized that many of these unusual requests had originated with Derek. He was using our partnership to gain access to client systems and data, I explained to Patricia. I have documentation showing that he charged clients for security audits that were actually data mining operations. He was collecting proprietary information from small businesses and potentially selling it to their competitors. Patricia leaned forward, her professional interest clearly engaged. Do you have evidence of this data collection and sale? I pulled out what I considered my strongest piece of evidence, a series of email exchanges I'd discovered in my partnership communication archives. Derek had been careless about CCing me on messages that revealed much more than he'd intended. Look at this, I said, pointing to an email chain from 8 months earlier. Derek is discussing a competitive intelligence report with someone named M. Rodriguez about one of our mutual clients, Peterson Manufacturing. The email references acquisition target analysis and proprietary process documentation that Derek obtained through our service relationship. The emails showed Derek essentially conducting corporate espionage, using his legitimate IT consulting access to gather sensitive business information that he then packaged and sold to interested parties. Some of the information appeared to be used by competing companies to undercut Peterson Manufacturing's bids on major contracts. Jesus, Patricia muttered, reading through the email chain. If this is accurate, we're talking about commercial espionage, breach of fiduciary duty, and potentially criminal fraud. I had similar documentation for 3 other clients, showing a pattern of Derek exploiting his trusted access to steal and monetize confidential business information. The revelation had made me physically sick when I'd first discovered it. I'd been an unwitting accomplice to the destruction of small businesses that had trusted us to help them succeed. The partnership termination wasn't just about taking over my client relationships, I realized aloud. It was about cutting me out before I discovered what he was really doing. Patricia spent another hour reviewing my documentation, asking detailed questions about dates, communications, and business relationships. Her legal assistant made photocopies of key documents, and Patricia took extensive notes about potential charges and legal strategies. Mr. Chen, she finally said, removing her reading glasses and fixing me with a direct stare. This is one of the most thorough investigative efforts I've seen from a non-attorney. You've assembled a compelling case that goes far beyond simple partnership disputes. Does that mean you'll take the case? It means I'm willing to take the case, but I want you to understand what you're getting into. Derek Morrison has resources and connections that will make this fight expensive and difficult. Corporate fraud cases can take years to resolve, and there's always the possibility that we'll lose despite having strong evidence. Patricia outlined the potential legal strategy. We would file civil suits for breach of contract, fraud, and commercial espionage, while simultaneously reporting Derek's activities to state and federal authorities for potential criminal investigation. The civil case would seek damages for my lost business, the destruction of my client relationships, and the broader economic harm Derek had caused to multiple small businesses. The good news is that commercial fraud cases sometimes attract the attention of prosecutors looking to make examples of white-collar criminals, Patricia explained. If we can get law enforcement interested, that adds significant pressure to any settlement negotiations. The retainer fee was substantial but manageable. Patricia offered a payment plan that would allow me to maintain my business operations while pursuing the case. More importantly, she agreed to work on a partial contingency basis, meaning her fees would increase significantly only if we achieved a successful outcome. One more thing, Patricia said as I prepared to leave. This kind of case generates attention. Derek will likely try to discredit you personally and professionally. He'll use every resource at his disposal to make you look like a disgruntled ex-partner making wild accusations. Are you prepared for that kind of scrutiny? I thought about the humiliation at the family reunion, about Derek's confident laughter and the way my relatives had dismissed my concerns. I thought about Jennifer Walsh crying over the phone about her destroyed business, and about the small business owners who'd trusted Derek and ended up paying for that trust with their livelihoods. I'm prepared, I said. Let's file the lawsuit. 2 days later, Derek Morrison received legal notification that he was being sued for fraud, breach of contract, commercial espionage, and conspiracy. According to Patricia, the process server found Derek at his Sacramento office, surrounded by the trappings of success that had been built on the destruction of small businesses and the betrayal of family trust. I wondered if he was still laughing. The Maricopa County Superior Court building rose from downtown Phoenix like a monument to the ideal that justice could be achieved through bureaucracy, persistence, and the careful application of legal principles to human conflicts. Its glass and steel facade reflected the Arizona sun with blinding intensity, creating geometric patterns of light and shadow that shifted throughout the day as the building's surfaces caught and redirected the desert light. The architecture was modern and imposing, designed to convey both accessibility and authority, a place where ordinary citizens could seek redress for grievances, but also where the full weight of legal consequence could be brought to bear against those who violated society's rules. The security checkpoint at the main entrance processed a steady stream of lawyers in expensive suits, defendants in their best attempt at respectable clothing, plaintiffs clutching folders of documentation, and witnesses who represented every possible variation of human drama that could end up requiring judicial resolution. Metal detectors hummed. Constantly, security guards maintained professional vigilance, and the marble floors echoed with the footsteps of people whose lives were being fundamentally altered by the legal process. 18 months had passed since I'd first walked into Patricia Hernandez's modest office, with a folder full of documents and a burning sense of injustice that had consumed my thoughts and dominated my actions. 18 months of depositions, where lawyers had questioned every aspect of my business practices and personal motivations, discovery motions that had required me to produce thousands of pages of documentation, settlement negotiations that had gone nowhere because Derek refused to acknowledge any wrongdoing, and legal maneuvering that had tested every aspect of my determination and financial resources. The case had indeed attracted the attention that Patricia had predicted, though the process had been far more complex and emotionally draining than either of us had anticipated. The Arizona Attorney General's office had opened a criminal investigation into Derek's business practices after our civil lawsuit revealed the scope of his commercial espionage activities and provided prosecutors with evidence of systematic fraud that extended far beyond simple partnership disputes. The FBI's white-collar crime unit had gotten involved when their investigation discovered that Derek's data theft operations had crossed state lines, potentially violating federal commercial espionage statutes that carried serious criminal penalties. Federal prosecutors had been particularly interested in Derek's systematic targeting of small businesses in multiple states, which suggested an organized criminal enterprise rather than isolated incidents of unethical business practices. But Derek hadn't gone down quietly, and his resistance had been both more sophisticated and more vindictive than I'd expected when we'd first filed the lawsuit. He'd hired a team of expensive attorneys from Blackstone, Murphy & Associates, one of Phoenix's most prestigious corporate law firms, and they'd fought our case with every legal weapon in their considerable arsenal. Their strategy had been to overwhelm us with paperwork, exhaust our financial resources through prolonged litigation, and destroy my credibility through personal attacks that were designed to make me appear unstable, vindictive, and motivated by jealousy rather than legitimate grievances. They'd filed motions to dismiss our case on technical grounds, challenged the admissibility of virtually every piece of evidence we'd assembled, questioned my mental competence in business, judgment, and attempted to characterize the entire dispute as the resentful complaints of a failed businessman who couldn't accept responsibility for his own poor decisions. Their legal briefs had portrayed Derek as a successful entrepreneur who'd tried to help a struggling family member, only to be attacked by litigation when that help hadn't produced the results the family member had unrealistically expected. The discovery process had been particularly brutal and invasive, lasting for over a year and requiring both sides to produce thousands of pages of documentation that revealed the most intimate details of our business and personal lives. Derek's attorneys had demanded access to my personal financial records going back 5 years, my business communications with every client I'd ever served, my college transcripts and employment history, my medical records to determine if I had any mental health issues that might affect my reliability as a witness, and even my social media accounts to look for evidence of personal instability or vindictive behavior. They'd deposed everyone who'd ever worked with me professionally, looking for any evidence that I was incompetent, dishonest, difficult to work with, or motivated by personal grudges rather than legitimate business concerns. Maria and James, my former employees, had been subjected to hours of questioning about my management style, my technical competence, my emotional stability, and my relationship with Derek. Even customers who'd been satisfied with my repair services had been contacted and questioned about their experiences, with Derek's attorneys clearly hoping to find complaints or problems that could be used to undermine my credibility. But discovery worked both ways in the legal system, and Patricia had used the court-ordered disclosure process to uncover evidence that even my exhaustive personal investigation had missed. Derek's business records, obtained through court order after months of legal fighting, revealed a systematic pattern of fraud that stretched back over 7 years and involved at least 12 small businesses across 6 western states. The scale and sophistication of Derek's operations had been far greater than any of us had initially realized. The most damaging revelation had come from Derek's own email archives, discovered when his attorney's attempts to destroy evidence had backfired spectacularly. In trying to delete thousands of potentially incriminating messages from his business accounts, Derek had overlooked the fact that his IT consulting firm's own backup systems had preserved copies of everything, including emails he'd thought were permanently destroyed. The irony that Derek's own technical expertise had been used against him was not lost on anyone involved in the case. Among those recovered emails were detailed discussions of his strategy for identifying and exploiting small business partnerships, written in language so explicitly predatory that even Derek's own attorneys had struggled to present alternative interpretations during depositions. The emails revealed Derek's systematic approach to targeting vulnerable businesses, his methods for gaining their trust, and his strategies for extracting maximum value before terminating relationships and moving on to new victims. The key is finding businesses that are successful enough to be worth acquiring, but small enough that the owners don't have sophisticated legal representation or extensive business experience. Derek had written to Marcus Rodriguez, a business associate, who helped him identify potential targets. Family connections are ideal because people let their guard down when they think they're dealing with relatives. Personal trust is the enemy of good business sense. Patricia had found emails where Derek literally referred to his partnership targets as marks, and described his termination strategies as harvest operations designed to extract maximum value from relationships while minimizing legal exposure. The language was so explicitly criminal in its intent that Derek's defense team had been forced to argue that their client was simply using colorful metaphors to describe legitimate business practices, an argument that had convinced no one who read the actual communications. But perhaps the most significant breakthrough had come when Jennifer Walsh, the Las Vegas graphic designer whose business Derek had destroyed, decided to join our lawsuit as a co-plaintiff. Her participation had given us access to additional evidence and had demonstrated the systematic nature of Derek's fraud scheme. Jennifer's story, combined with testimony from two other former Derek partners who'd been located through the legal process, painted a picture of calculated predation that went far beyond simple business disputes. Derek had specifically targeted small business owners who were family members or close personal friends, using existing trust relationships to circumvent the normal caution people exercise in business dealings. The criminal investigation had proceeded, parallel to our civil case, and federal prosecutors had ultimately filed charges of commercial espionage, wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, and racketeering against Derek and two associates who'd helped him market stolen business information to competing companies. The criminal case had provided additional evidence for our civil lawsuit, while also putting enormous pressure on Derek to consider settlement rather than risk potential prison time that could extend for decades. Marcus Rodriguez, Derek's primary business associate, had been arrested at his Las Vegas office and had quickly agreed to cooperate with federal investigators in exchange for a reduced sentence. His testimony and the records he provided revealed the full scope of Derek's criminal enterprise, including detailed financial records of payments received for stolen business information and contracts with corporate clients who'd knowingly purchased illegally obtained competitive intelligence. Derek's response to the mounting legal pressure had been characteristic of his personality: aggressive, manipulative, and focused on destroying his accusers rather than addressing the underlying allegations or acknowledging any responsibility for his actions. Rather than negotiating seriously for a settlement that might have limited his legal exposure, he'd chosen to fight every aspect of both the civil and criminal cases while simultaneously launching a campaign of personal destruction against everyone who'd testified against him. He'd launched a countersuit claiming that I had stolen his business methods and client relationships, despite overwhelming evidence that the flow of information and resources had gone entirely in the opposite direction. He'd spread rumors within our extended family that I was mentally unstable and motivated by jealousy of his success, apparently hoping that family pressure would convince me to drop the lawsuit. He'd even hired a private investigator to look for evidence of personal wrongdoing that could be used to discredit me, apparently believing that attacking my character would somehow excuse his criminal behavior. The next few weeks brought a series of developments that completed Derek's downfall. The public apology, published as court-ordered in major newspapers, generated additional media coverage that destroyed what remained of Derek's business reputation. Several major clients terminated their contracts, citing concerns about working with someone who'd been found guilty of commercial fraud. More satisfying than Derek's professional destruction, however, was the response from my extended family. The relatives who'd laughed at my legal threats 18 months earlier now reached out with awkward apologies and expressions of support. Uncle Robert, Derek's own father, called to congratulate me on my victory and to express his shame about his son's conduct. "I raised him better than this," Uncle Robert said during our conversation, his voice heavy with disappointment. "Family is supposed to mean something. What Derek did to you, to those other business owners, it's not how I taught him to treat people." The family reunion that year had a very different atmosphere. Derek, unsurprisingly, didn't attend, but his absence was felt by everyone present. Several relatives made a point of asking about my business and expressing admiration for my persistence in pursuing justice. The cousin who'd been dismissed as delusional was now seen as someone who'd had the courage to stand up to a bully and win. But the most meaningful moment came when Jennifer Walsh flew in from Las Vegas to attend the reunion as my guest. Her business had been destroyed by Derek's fraud, but she'd used her share of the settlement to start over with a new graphic design firm that was already showing signs of success. "You gave me my life back," she told me as we stood in the same hotel conference room where Derek had humiliated me 2 years earlier. "Not just the money, though, that helped. You proved that people like Derek don't always win. that sometimes the little guy can fight back and get justice. The civil judgment had been just the beginning of Derek's legal troubles. The federal criminal case had resulted in a plea agreement that included 3 years of probation, community service, and substantial financial penalties. But more damaging to Derek's long-term prospects were the professional consequences, the loss of business licenses, the destruction of his reputation, and the civil lawsuits filed by other victims who'd been emboldened by our successful case. Within 6 months of our court victory, Derek's Sacramento consulting firm had filed for bankruptcy. The man who'd once boasted about multi-million-dollar government contracts was now working as a junior IT support technician for a corporate call center. His entrepreneurial career effectively ended by the consequences of his own greed and arrogance. The last communication I received from Derek was a brief email sent 6 months after the judgment, apparently from a generic email account rather than his former business address. "Marcus," it read, "I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I put you through, what I put everyone through. I thought I was just being smart about business, but I was destroying people's lives. I'm sorry for what I did to you and your business. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed to say it. Derek." I never responded to the email. Some bridges, once burned by betrayal and exploitation, can't be rebuilt with simple apologies. But I kept the message as a reminder that even the most arrogant people can sometimes be forced to confront the consequences of their actions. My electronics repair business continued to grow, eventually expanding into 2 locations and employing 8 full-time technicians. The publicity from the lawsuit had attracted customers who valued integrity and persistence, and word-of-mouth referrals from satisfied clients provided steady growth without the need for predatory partnership schemes. More importantly, the experience had taught me valuable lessons about trust, family, and the intersection of personal relationships and business dealings. I'd learned that shared blood doesn't guarantee shared values, that laughter can be a weapon used to dismiss legitimate concerns, and that sometimes the only way to stop a bully is to fight back with everything you have. But I'd also learned that justice, while sometimes slow and expensive, is still possible in a system that allows individuals to challenge more powerful opponents. That documentation and persistence can overcome wealth and connections. That truth, when properly presented and vigorously defended, can triumph over manipulation and deception. The settlement money had allowed me to accomplish several important goals that extended far beyond simply recovering my financial losses. I'd been able to pay off my student loans completely, eliminating a monthly burden that had constrained my financial flexibility for years. I'd expanded my business into a second location in Scottsdale that specialized in serving high-end residential clients, creating employment opportunities for 3 additional technicians and establishing a revenue stream that was entirely independent of the commercial relationships Derek had destroyed. Most importantly, I'd established a small legal defense fund for other small business owners facing similar exploitation, working with Patricia to create a resource that could provide initial legal consultation and case evaluation for entrepreneurs who couldn't afford expensive attorney fees. The fund had already helped 2 other business owners identify and address fraudulent partnership arrangements before they suffered the kind of devastating losses that Jennifer Walsh and I had experienced. Patricia Hernandez had become not just my attorney but a trusted advisor and friend, helping me structure new business relationships in ways that protected against the kind of predatory practices Derek had employed. She'd also become something of a specialist in small business fraud cases, using the precedent established by our successful litigation to help other victims pursue justice against sophisticated predators who targeted vulnerable entrepreneurs. What Derek did to you and the other victims represents a particularly insidious form of white-collar crime, Patricia had explained during one of our post-settlement meetings. He specifically targeted family members and personal friends because those relationships created natural barriers to the kind of skeptical due diligence that would have exposed his fraud. Most people don't want to hire lawyers to review agreements with relatives, and Derek understood that vulnerability and exploited it systematically. The experience had transformed my understanding of business relationships and the importance of proper legal protection, but it had also taught me valuable lessons about persistence, documentation, and the power of ordinary people to challenge sophisticated criminals when they're willing to fight back with everything they have. 2 years after the judgment, I received an invitation to speak at the Arizona Small Business Association's annual conference about protecting entrepreneurial ventures from fraudulent partnerships. The conference was held at the same Marriott hotel where Derek had humiliated me at the family reunion, and walking into that familiar space brought back vivid memories of that awful day when I'd been laughed at by relatives who thought I was making wild accusations. Standing before an audience of over 200 hopeful business owners, I shared the complete story of Derek's betrayal and our successful fight for justice, emphasizing the critical importance of proper legal counsel, thorough documentation of all business relationships, and the courage to stand up to bullies regardless of their apparent resources or family connections. The most important lesson I learned, I told the audience, is that trust must be earned through actions not assumed because of relationships. Family connections, personal friendships, shared history. None of these guarantee ethical behavior in business dealings. Protect yourself with proper contracts, independent legal advice, and careful documentation of all agreements. After my presentation, a young woman approached me with a familiar story. A business partnership with a college friend that was beginning to show troubling signs of exploitation and control. I gave her Patricia's contact information and encouraged her to seek legal counsel before the situation deteriorated further. Don't wait until you're being laughed at in a room full of people who think you're making wild accusations, I advised her. Document everything. Trust your instincts and remember that sometimes the only way to stop someone from destroying your dreams is to fight back with everything you have. Driving home through Phoenix's desert landscape that evening, past the strip malls and housing developments that had been the backdrop for my legal battle, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed since that morning when Derek's termination email had shattered my naive trust in family loyalty. The boy who'd signed a partnership agreement without proper legal review had become a man who understood the importance of documentation, preparation, and professional advice. The victim who'd been humiliated at a family reunion had become someone willing to stand up to bullies regardless of their resources or connections. The small business owner who'd nearly lost everything to a predatory partner had become an advocate for others facing similar exploitation. Derek had taught me inadvertently and at great cost to himself that laughter can be temporary, but justice can be permanent. That humiliation can be overcome with persistence and truth. That sometimes the people who dismiss your concerns most loudly are the ones who have the most to fear from your success. He wasn't laughing anymore, but I was smiling, secure in the knowledge that sometimes, if you're willing to fight hard enough and long enough, the good guys really do win.